Welcome back to Kernel at the Buzzer. We want to remind you that all the opinions of everyone on this podcast are the opinion of the speaker and the speaker alone and do not reflect the opinion of the entire Kernel. I'm your host, Colton Johnson, and this week it is once again all Kentucky football. We're going to talk about this matchup with the Ohio Bobcats, Trayanum's turn to the field, and what's next for Kentucky football as they head down to Oxford for a matchup with the Ole Miss Rebels. All that more next. Welcome back to Kernel at the Buzzer. I'm your host, Colton Johnson, and this week I have two guests. Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Jonathon Bruner, a football beat writer and assistant sports editor.
I am Cole Parke, and I am the sports editor.
You know, I'm always a big fan of these type of weeks. You know, you get to have these kind of lighter matchups in the past, looking ahead to a big juggernaut matchup. You know, JB, we were in that press box at the Ohio game. I want to know what you saw.
I saw a lot of what we should have seen, I feel like. It should have been a lopsided score, and it was. I think a lot of it, we did see some improvements out of the offense, but also you kind of take it with a grain of salt because it was a far lesser opponent than anyone, you know. So it's kind of back to Southern Miss where it was like, yeah, it looked good, but also can you replicate that against an SEC opponent? And I think that's always kind of the next step. I think the defense kind of continued to do their thing, which was also expected. I think a lot of the improvements in the pass game, though, were a good sight to see at least, no matter who it was against, because that is something, especially over the last 2 weeks, that has just been non-existent. So I thought it was a lot of kind of what we expected and maybe some improvements in some areas, but until you can do it against an SEC opponent, I can't really call it super improvement or anything that I've seen drastic, you know.
Yep. Some numbers for you. Brock Vandegrift was 70 for 24 in the air for 237 passing yards, 7 rushes on the ground for 21 yards. Demi Sumo-Karnbe had 85 total yards, about half and half in the air and on the ground. Dane Key with a monster day, 7 receptions for 145 yards, and a surprise from Jamarion Wilcox, 8 carries for 82 yards. CP, I was surprised, Mr. Wilcox.
I was too. I was watching the game, and I kept finding myself having moments where I'm like, is that Wilcox on the field right now? And he was killing it. I mean, we talked about before the year started, before Chip went down, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, you know, this running back by committee system. And we had Patterson, who had been pretty reliable, although he had to go out with an injury for a little while. But Demi's kind of been carrying a lot of that load even with Patterson. So seeing another guy like Wilcox get in there is really kind of reinvigorating those ideas of running back by committee, especially with Chip coming back. You know, certainly want it to be a case where hopefully this is not the last big game we see from Wilcox. Hopefully it's not the last big game we see from Demi Sumo-Karnbe. Hopefully we get Patterson back in there now that Chip's back. You know, I think that this run game for Kentucky, especially when you look in weeks prior, has been really the only thing it's had going for it to some extent. So it was good to see the passing game get going, but it was also good to see the run game stay strong and even stay surprising despite the pass game kind of taking a lot of those headlines.
Yeah, and pretty uniform for the defense and the special teams, like El said. I mean, and even especially for Rayner, you know, we talk about setting records. He did it last week. He did it this week. It's always been uniform for him, but I really want to talk about this defense, especially Mr. Hairston. What did you see from him this week, JB?
I mean, I thought we saw kind of some of the ball hawking abilities with that pick six that kind of became accustomed to seeing with the 5 interceptions last year, the interception returns, the pick sixes. You know, I think a lot of it was kind of him playing at a high level. But once again, it goes right back to the point of, can you do that against an SEC opponent? And I mean, he'll be thrown into the fire this weekend. So I mean, you know, we'll see how he comes down from a big game to an even bigger one that matters a whole lot more than this one did. So I mean, but I think we saw the ball hawking ability, his ability to do those things, but also, if he gets torched for a bunch of yards against Ole Miss, then it's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the records. That was I believe it tied the school record, 3 pick sixes. So that's pretty notable, especially since both of the first 2 came in the same game last year. So good to see him able to do that again. But like JB touched on, and we'll get more into it with Ole Miss preview, I'm sure. But you're going against a team away with a quarterback who's got 1,500 passing yards. So I'm glad he got a pick 6 against Ohio, the Bobcats. But if that's what he needs to get motivated going into Ole Miss, that's fantastic. But it's going to be a trial by fire once again this week.
Before we get into the Rebels and what's to come, one of the bigger midweek headlines, Mr. Trayanum. He's back in timely fashion. CP, I want you to elaborate on the process of finding out that he's back and playable at 9 p.m.
Well, first, it's really funny that it is before the Ole Miss game of all games, because last year, or 2 years ago, it was Chris Rodriguez who was suspended, and then he came back right before the Ole Miss game. So something about these Rebels getting Cats back healthy, I guess,
I know,
and
right?
back able to play. But yeah, I was a bit frustrated, admittedly. We had got a bunch of stories out that day. We were ready to go. We had a meeting as far as the Kentucky Kernel goes. We were starting to gear down. Stories been going out throughout the day for us sports. I know Mark Stoops has his show every Monday night, I suppose, so should have known better. But he usually doesn't really say a whole lot on those shows, so we sometimes get away with not doing a whole lot with that. But I'm headed back home. In the process of literally driving home down Nicholasville Road, and I see that headline pops up, and I'm like, oh, buddy. Because that's a big one. That's a big one. So we kind of had to immediately, you guys are all in the group. We texted, is anybody able to write this really quick? Thankfully, Sarah was. She got that out, and we double socialed it going out that night and the next morning. But it did create a bit of a headache for me around 9 p.m. on a Monday night.
Now, I think it'd be a lot different conversation if the running game was struggling coming back to the team. But with the way that Demi's playing, the way that Patterson's been involved, and especially with the emergence of Jamarian Wilcox, I kind of, and I want thoughts from both of you on this, I kind of wonder how he's going to, obviously he's probably not, from a usage-wise, they're not just going to throw him into the fire, just give him the reins. But when going down the road, I'm curious on how they're going to apply him.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting story to watch, because I did not think coming into the year you would have 4 usable running backs that you could put on the field and feel okay about. So I think it's going to be an interesting balancing act, but I also think if the passing game stays struggling like it is, then there's going to be a lane carved out for all 4 of those guys to kind of make their way. But as far as immediate impact, I'm not sure that we're going to see a ton of it. I just feel like that, like we mentioned before, the running game has not necessarily been an issue, so it's not like he's going to come in and solve a problem. Mm-hmm. So I think he is definitely going to add, and, seeing his skill set, coming from Ohio State, that's a prestigious football program, coming from a school like that to here, I think it's going to be interesting to see him in action and see what he can bring to the table. But I also don't think he's not going to be a savior by any means, because his position group has been probably the only one that hasn't lacked so far this year on offense.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of agree saying I don't think they're just going to throw him into the fire, but if anyone's thinking about doing that, I would say don't. You don't need to.
Yeah.
If respectfully, if Chip is getting the first carry and not Demi, I think there's a problem there, because Demi should absolutely continue to be leading that group right now, where Chip is just coming off injury, but where Demi, he's proved himself. I've got his numbers up. He's got 274 rushing yards for 3 touchdowns this year. He's not Ray Davis, but we knew that already. He's been fantastic. The Kentucky run game has not been struggling at all. If you go by EA College Football 25, Chip's a dog. He's going to do fantastic. But whether or not he lives up to that, especially coming off a hand injury, we don't know yet. I would say against a team as good as Ole Miss especially, he should be limited, because the last thing you want is to send him out there and then him get injured again. Obviously he's practicing this week, so they'll know how good that hand is, I suppose. But I would still say to proceed with caution in that regard. One thing that I think could be interesting, though, is if Chip is back, he's good to go, he's ready to play, we still presume we're going to have a committee-based system. You still expect to see Demi, you still expect to see Wilcox, but something that's interesting to look at, where he had an injured game, where he didn't play, we saw it earlier this week with DeVaron Rayner. Might they look at redshirting Patterson? Still a freshman guy. That's something they could do. He's shown that he's really good so far. Mm-hmm. But if you've got 3 other big running backs, might they consider redshirting him? Might they consider, saying, we like you, but we want you to be here next year stronger? There's no reason to waste your talents this year. We got Wilcox, Chip, and Demi now. There's not really a reason, to waste a year of eligibility, so to say. So that's something that they could do. That's not a scoop or a source. That's just an idea I had. I'm not saying that's what they're doing. But I think that could be a real way that Chip could impact this. I expect that by next week, if not this week, he will be the number 1 option, just because you brought him in to be the number 1 option. So he could surprise all of us and be way better than we even imagine. And Kentucky could have its 4th straight just phenomenal running back. But if it doesn't, I think that he will do fantastic alongside Demi, who's really shown a lot of what he could do. Really surprised a lot of people this year after not really doing a ton last year.
Now, in y'all's minds, how much of a probability is there that Demi continues as the primary back for the rest of the year?
I think it's going to depend on how Chip does. One, I think he should absolutely be considered for it because, like I said, he's done spectacular this year. He had a good game against Georgia. He had a good game against South Carolina, despite the circumstances. Obviously, he's done fine against Southern Miss and Ohio, I would hope. But, I think that there's definitely, if you're a coach at Kentucky, that's something you really have to be considering. I mean, you've got a guy who you're high on. You know he's good, but he's been injured. You haven't really seen what he can do, and 2 of your freebie games are gone now. Yeah. So you know Demi's going to get it done. So I would say Demi should, at least for South Carolina, for Ole Miss, should definitively be the starter, with Chip kind of being a supplemental, kind of see how he does. And then from there, it's going to really just be grading how well is Chip doing. But I would say until proven otherwise, Demi should absolutely get the benefit of the doubt there.
I agree. Now, last thing I want to touch on before we get into the Rebels. I want to talk about Mr. Key. Obviously, he had the monster performance. Everyone saw that. There's not really much to talk about performance-wise. But with this team, because we always talked about the Barry and Dane duo. That's always been the narrative. And I think depending on how much you watch football, I think it's pretty easy to understand that Berrien is a much better kick returner than he is a wide receiver.
Mm-hmm. And also counter that he's really good on jet sweeps too.
Very good on jet sweeps. Yeah. And I think, in terms of how he'd be, hypothetically, if he'd be applied in the pros, I just don't see how a team could use a Berrien Brown as a wide receiver. Now, Dane, I'll take Dane every day of the week. I think he's definitely become that type of safety blanket. But JB, I don't know what you saw that weekend. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think both Brock and Dane touched on it post-game. They both brought up how that chemistry between themselves and between each other. But, what Key was doing on the field, the way he was able to make the grab and then run. And we saw the hurdle. You just see his athleticism in the open field, and you want more. You want more of it every single time you watch him have a game like he did on Saturday. You're just like, wow, more of that anytime. It was a fun sight to see, and just see him out there just kind of doing his thing, and then seeing how much Brock relied on. You even had one of those plays where it turned into a scramble drill, and you even saw Key, waving him down. That takes chemistry. That's not something that just happens overnight, and I think it's between those two for sure. And as the passing game gets going, if it gets going, that it's going to be with Key as the driving force on it. And then I would maybe look for like Macklin to maybe step up a little bit more to try to supplement Key better with, and not necessarily showcase Brown as the WR2.
Yeah, I'd like to see both Ferrier and Macklin start stepping up and get that. But you touched on it a little bit there. That's kind of my biggest point watching the game, was that the scramble drill really showed me a lot about what Dane Key could be. I'm not even I don't want to say they're the same because that would be almost blasphemous, but it reminds me a little bit of Wandale Robinson and his ability to just make a play for Will Levis. When they start scrambling, Key immediately throws that hand up. And what a lot of people, that's important to me, but what is also important to me is he had to go up for that ball too. It was not particularly that well thrown, but he still brought it down. I'm a big believer watching football, as I'm sure we all are. A good wide receiver can make a quarterback look better than they are.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Definitively. And I think that ability, especially in a modern NFL where so many quarterbacks have to scramble, have to be on the run, the kind of the Patrick Mahomes archetype, a wide receiver being able to identify a problem immediately, recognize how to fix it, and go up and make a play, I think that's really, really special for his ability and what he could be going forward. I think that, obviously it's still on Brock to get the ball in that vicinity. Yeah. The passing game's still going to have to rely on the quarterback, but I think Key really showed a lot of what he could be to elevate not only himself, but a quarterback he's with as well.
Now, speaking of quarterbacks and passing games, I'm going to throw some numbers out about this Rebel offense. They're averaging 55 points a game, 49.5 margin of victory. Jackson Dart, he's averaging 389 yards in the air and 3 touchdowns a game. It's a pretty moderate rushing threat. I would put him on par, maybe a little below Brock in the rushing game. Trey Harris, their wide receiver 1, he's averaging 157 yards a game and a touchdown. He's one of the 2 wide receivers that they have that's averaging a touchdown a game. And Henry Parrish Jr. is averaging 107 rushing yards per game and has 7 touchdowns on the year. This is an offense to end all offenses.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're simply looking at the best offense in the country. I mean, I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination. That doesn't mean they're the best team. That's not what that means. But I do think they are far and away the best offense. I mean, we were there during the Southern Miss game week 1, and we were waiting out the lightning delay. We look, and before half, it was like 50 plus already.
Yeah, they 70 spotted them.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, and yes, it has been non-conference opponents so far. Yes, it has. And, even Lane Kiffin brought that up at a presser today, or maybe yesterday. I saw the clip today where he said, someone asked him, do you feel like you've been prepared for SEC competition? And he was like, no. He was like, I don't. He was like, but I hope our practices have prepared us for that, something along those lines, but not the in-game competition has prepared them for SEC. And duh. Yeah. Because, I mean, those stats are insane, but they're also a bit jaded.
Their best opponent is one game against Wake Forest.
Exactly. So I think they're a bit jaded, but that's not to take any credit away from them. They are still that good.
I will not stand for the Furman slander.
Okay. FCS Furman. I would put them as the 4th best team they've played out of 4 games. No, I mean, I think you touched on a lot. I mean, certainly even the team knows it. They haven't played anybody yet. No disrespect, Demon Deacons, but even then, with those stats, they've never scored less than 40 points a game.
Yep.
And that 40-point game was against Wake Forest, 40-6 in North Carolina, so that's pretty substantial. They dropped 76 against Furman, 52 against Middle Tennessee, and 52 against Georgia Southern. I mean, this is an offense that is hot. And, Kentucky's an offense that is less hot.
It's not hot.
We don't really know how well the Ole Miss defense has been tested, so I don't know how well Kentucky's going to do there, but Kentucky's defense is certainly going to have its work cut out for it because, simply put, regardless of who they've played, this offense is going into this game confident. They're going in that ready to play, and they're going into that not really questioning their abilities. They know they can score touchdowns. They know they can run the ball. They know they can pass the ball really well. Mm-hmm. And they know that they can drive down a field and score 7 points every possession if they want to, theoretically. So this is one that is going to be a major test for the Kentucky defense. And I think that, kind of like you guys said, until proven otherwise, this might be the best offense in the country.
I mean, It's on paper. We've seen it all year, but the big question that I kind of want to touch on is, we talked about with the Georgia game, how it was a loss. And, of course, Stoops and all the players came out and they were like, we're not happy with these moral victories. We lost. At the end of the day, they went back in that locker room and was like, good job, guys. Heck of a job. So obviously this game has the ability to be of the same capacity, but is it going to be the same mood?
No, because I don't think it's going to be the same result. I think this game is going to be a lot of what people thought Georgia was going to be. Because you kind of look at Georgia retrospectively afterwards, because even I thought going into Georgia it was going to be a rough game. But then you look at some of the stats of Georgia historically just not playing well at Kroger Field for whatever reason, and you're like, okay, I can see how that happened. And then you look at how the defense played that particular game, and you can go, okay, that makes sense. There's nothing about this game where I can go, okay, it would make sense if they didn't get blown out. Mm-hmm. That's the way I'm looking at this game. So, but if I would consider anything within like 10 to 20 points not that embarrassing. I would say after that it's when it starts getting a little rough. I mean, this defense has played well so far, and they did play well against Georgia, But I also just think that the typical makeup of a Georgia team is not offense first. This is an offense first team. Yeah. This team plays for shootouts. They play to put up high points, and they dare you to keep up with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be where Kentucky falls short. It's not going to matter how good their defense plays. If they can't score at least 28 to 35 points, they're not going to win this game.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about the Georgia streak and how many games Georgia's won over Kentucky in a row, and it's because they play every year. Sure. Kentucky hasn't beat Ole Miss since 2011 either. That's 13 years, if I can do math correctly.
Accurate.
That's wild. And I also think it was important to note that despite what we were saying, especially coming off the South Carolina game, Kentucky and Georgia usually play pretty close.
Yeah.
Last year was a bit of a blowout in Georgia, but you look at games in Lexington, and Kentucky usually kind of holds Georgia pretty close. It's kind of like, not to be that guy, but it might be their Super Bowl every year. So they play it close. Ole Miss is less of that. You don't play them as frequently. You've only played them 3 times since 2011. They've won every time. But, I don't want to, be the negative Nancy here, but like we said, I'm going into this expecting that it's not going to be pretty in Oxford. I think that the Ole Miss game could really be what people thought the Georgia game was. So in that sense, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of moral victories, but even if they do hold it close, I think there needs to be less moral victories because, sure, it's number 6 Ole Miss. They're undefeated. They're a really good team, but we're also 5 games into the season now, and you're sitting at 2-3.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a, you really got to start getting concerned, like, all right, well, we need at least 6 wins to go to a bowl game if Mark Stoops wants to keep up his streak there, and where are those 6 wins coming from? Because you've got 2. You've got 1 more against Murray State. But if you can't beat and can't really look that well against Ole Miss, you got blown out by South Carolina. Obviously, you could say Auburn, Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt's playing good football.
Vanderbilt was playing good football. They went down to the wire with a good Missouri team, who I know dropped in the rankings because of that game. It's still a good Missouri team.
Yes.
Kentucky's lucky it's not playing Missouri this year. Auburn, less playing good football. But even then, even if you're saying Auburn is a surefire win, that's 4. Where are the rest of these wins coming from if you're going to go to a bowl game, if you're Kentucky?
Yeah.
If you lose this game, especially if you lose it badly, not that you're not already necessarily, but you are actually going to have to start facing the music that you are staring down the barrel of potentially not even finishing 500 this season.
Now, we've talked about this, like, lower echelon of SEC teams. You have as of right now, Auburn, Mississippi State, Florida, Vanderbilt, and Northern Kentucky in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Kentucky only plays 2 of those also.
I know, and because I think before the year started, everyone was like, "Oh, well, they'll get the conference kicked off against South Carolina. They'll handle business there, and we'll go go to the bar, have a nice day." But looking at it now, if we're talking about their first SEC win, if they can scrape one out in Gainesville, sure. But
also in Gainesville makes it a bit harder. Florida, didn't they beat Mississippi State? So that
was in Starkville.
Yes, they're capable of winning a game. That's not one that I would say, even with as bad as Florida is, that's not one I would say is a guarantee either. I see that one kind of the same way as I see the Vandy game. Should Kentucky win? Maybe. Will they? I really don't know. They should have won against South Carolina.
Yeah, and Florida's due for a win against Kentucky.
Yeah,
they're going to eventually be tired of hearing that. And like we said, it's in the swamp. I think the program as a whole, I know you kind of mentioned the moral victory saying, I feel like the program as a whole should be past that. Mm-hmm. We got this bowl streak and there's this and that, but to this point with the program under Stoops, moral victory should not be what we're hanging our hat on now.
Yeah.
Like if this Georgia game would have happened six years ago, this would have been, whoa, like so proud of the team.
Yeah.
But now in 2024, this program has been built up enough to where coming up short in a game that you could have and some could argue should have won if you would have just done things correctly,
well,
then a little bit past that.
In that same vein also, we're talking from a Kentucky perspective, so we're saying Kentucky's circling these games, the Vandy, the Florida, saying like that's a winnable game.
Yeah.
Florida's got a brutal schedule.
I
bet in Gainesville they're circling the Kentucky game, saying that's one we need to win. That's one we ought to win.
Absolutely.
The same way we're talking about Vanderbilt, the same way we're talking about Florida, the same way we're talking about Auburn, that's what Florida's talking about Kentucky. So even we've been talking about, that's not even close to a given right now. That's one that if you're Billy Napier, especially, with your job security, you're saying, I have to beat Kentucky. I cannot lose to Kentucky this year.
Well, I wanted y'all's thoughts. Last thought before we get into predictions. What do y'all think, public opinion-wise? Big Blue Nation having the realization that this team, there is a pretty good probability that this team wins one conference game this year.
It's starting to look more realistic than it would if you'd have said this before week 1. I think I had them at 6-6, which was a lot lower than other people.
Yeah.
And I think that may even now be maybe a bit too conservative. We could very well be looking at 5-7.
Yep.
And that just being kind of what it is with, you're out of conference wins and then maybe.
Because Louisville's not playing bad football either.
That's what I'm saying.
I would go as far as to say fan reaction is going to be more nuclear if you lose the Louisville game than if you only win one conference game.
Yeah,
I think you can win 2 to 3 conference games, but if you lose to Louisville, it's not going to be pretty in Lexington.
I feel like I know what answer I'm going to get from y'all on this. So let's say the hypothetical scenario comes to fruition. Let's say the Kentucky drops one. Obviously, they get destroyed in Ole Miss, get beat by Vanderbilt, scrape a loss out in Florida, beat Auburn. They're not beating Tennessee. They're going to beat Murray State. They're not beating Texas. If they lose to Louisville, I'm assuming that's the swan song for Mark Stoops at Kentucky.
you got to think that the fans are just going to have given up by that point. I mean, theoretically speaking, looking at his contract, I think, too. I mean, Mark Stoops could probably stay for as long as he wanted to. Knowing Mitch Barnhart's track record, how the Calipari thing went, he's not going to force him out. So it's really going to come down to how Stoops proceeds from there, less than how Kentucky proceeds. But I think as far as fans are concerned, if that it does happen, and that's a big if, we don't really know how the season's going to go, but losing to Louisville, doing that poorly in conference play, I think a lot, if not most of the fan base is going to be saying it's time for a change.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've already shared my take on this. I think it's already time. I think you reach a certain point in a rebuild where, you go like this. If you can't continue to go like this, you go like this.
Or if you even go like this.
And that's kind of what Kentucky's been on since 2022. Yeah. Ever since the loss to Ole Miss in 2022, it went from here to here. And now if you have a season where you only win one game in conference play, you're going plummeting, spiraling. And so to me, I think loss to Louisville or not, if you win one conference game, it's time.
I mean, absolutely. I've said it in multiple stories. I've said it before, but stagnation in college athletics is death.
Yep.
And I remember I've done this job for a few years now, so I was there in 2022 when all this happened. I remember going into that season, I put out a column saying, this year is probably the biggest year in Kentucky football history. You get a preseason ranking. You have national attention. How are you going to handle that? How is the perception of this team going to be changed? That was a chance for Kentucky to take that next step. You have Levis coming back, 7-5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If, still people riding high, the 10-win season hadn't been vacated yet, people are still feeling all right about it, it happens. Then you bring in Devin Leary, and I said it was a less high-stakes scenario, but still high-stakes scenario, and
they managed to squander it.
They squandered it again. And then you have this year, and it was like, okay, well, this year, it was almost like alarm bells starting, this year has to be the year. And we were talking about this right now, and again, there's still a lot of football to be played. They could pull out some shocks here. Who knows? You never know. But as far as we're concerned and what it looks like, it's going to be another year of that same thing. So we're to the point now where it's not even a question of if they're stagnating, it's if they're in a downward spiral or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Official predictions. CP, what's happening in Oxford?
It's not going to be pretty.
No, it's not.
It's going to be really brutal, I think. I'm going to go, based on Ole Miss's scores, I'm going to go 37-14 Rebels.
JB, after a long 7-hour drive down, when you get into that stadium, what are you going to see?
I think I'm going to see 45-10 Ole Miss.
Okay. Yeah, I have them at 34-10. I think they get one big chunk play and capitalize on one drive to get into the end zone. Maybe a rain or kick, but
I'm willing to give Kentucky's defense the benefit of the doubt that they're better than Wake Forest defense was. But as far as offense goes, I think they might get one early and they might get one in garbage time, but I don't think most of the game they're going to be shut down.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that's going to do it for this week. I hope you enjoy that drive. It's really scenic. It's, trees and grass on both sides for 7 hours all the way down there.
Hey, should be a fun atmosphere nonetheless.
I did it 2 years ago.
It is a beautiful place once you get down there.
It is very nice, actually.
Looking forward to it.
This time of year, I had to go through Oxford when it was winter, not as nice. But this time of year, it was quite nice in Oxford.
Yeah, when the flowers are blossoming, the trees look nice. It's a pretty place.
Should be fun.
All righty. Well, we're gonna get out of here. We want to thank you for tuning in to this episode of Kernel at the Buzzer. Kentucky football is on a bye following the Ole Miss game, but we'll have plenty more for you next week as we preview their home game against the Vanderbilt Commodores. Until then, I want to encourage you to go to KYKernel.com or KYKernel Sports on Twitter or X for all of your UK athletics coverage. And until then, I've been Colton Johnson. We'll see you next time.